Well, welcome everybody. My name is Peter Zaynard. I'm with Triad Wild, which is the Triad chapter for the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. We're a new chapter, just started up this year. We're very excited to be hosting this Zoom meeting this evening. It's our third, and we're excited to hear more details from Jeff. The meeting or presentation tonight is on safe passage. And our presenter is Jeff Hunter, who's the Senior Program Manager with the National Parks Conservation Association. Jeff resides in the western part of North Carolina and is actively working on at least one crossing project now. My guess is he's probably involved in a number of others projects to varying degrees. For those of you who are not familiar with the subject, over the years, many of our roads and highways have been built through areas that are historically native migratory pathways where migratory animals such as bear, elk, wolves, deer, etc. migrate through, causing an unsafe situation for the animals and humans alike. Jeff's specific program, known as Bearwise, seeks to mitigate these issues by creating tunnels or passageways, allowing the animals to cross these roads or highways without endangering themselves or humans. Unfortunately, each year more and more animals are lost while crossing highways, and this is even more difficult for endangered animals with low reproduction rates. As for Jeff, Jeff worked with Verizon for 20 years, enabling him to buy a house and put his kids through college and all that good stuff, but he felt something was missing. He tried filling the void with volunteering at citizen science projects, and then he started a nonprofit that sent him out to speak to students. He spoke to more than 120,000 in 7 years. One of those students' parents convinced him that he had a higher calling and needed to get a degree in something environmental. Jeff took it to heart and enrolled, graduating when he was 41 years old back in 2003. And he went on to pursue his master's at Unity College in Maine. And as I said earlier, Jeff currently resides in Western North Carolina and works with the National Parks Conservation Association, mainly on the Bearwise program, in the Pigeon River Gorge Wildlife Connectivity Project, aka Safe Passage, in the Smoky Mountains, Western North Carolina area. And with that, I am going to be quiet and mute everybody and turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Peter, very much. Can you hear me okay? And can you see my screen?
I can, yes.
Wonderful.
I hope everyone else
just
can.
One correction, Peter. So the presentation is on safe passage. Bearwise is another project that I work on. I facilitate the work of the Smoky Mountains Bearwise Community Task Force. And Bearwise is a relatively new program that emerged out of the Southeast, which seeks to address conflict issues with bears, usually around food or bird feeders, how to coexist with bears. And that's really important in communities like Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge, where there are a lot of bears in the park and they leave the park to find human anthropogenic sources of food, shall we say. But with that correction, let me just delve into this presentation. I'm grateful that Robin asked me to present, so thank you. A little bit about National Parks Conservation Association. As you can see, the logo, we were established 3 years ago. Next month or in May, it will be 103 years old. I've only been with the organization for coming on 7 years, but we advocate to protect and enhance America's national parks for present and future generations. And that involves all manner of things, either working on clean air, clean water, wildlife issues like I'll be talking about today, park funding, overcrowding issues, you name it. If it deals with national parks, we're probably addressing it in one way or another. I have about 165 colleagues all around the country. We have, I believe, 28 offices. We're based in DC, but we have field offices all over the country. I have an office in Asheville. I don't go there very often. I mostly work from home in Yancey County in Burnsville. But yeah, thrilled to talk about safe passage. And I know my colleague Steve has talked to some other chapters. If you've seen Steve present, a lot of the work that I'm presenting is his, actually. Credit where credit is due. He's a wildlife biologist. I'm not. I'm an organizer, I'm a facilitator. I guess my main superpower is bringing people together to have successful meetings. And that's the role that I play in Safe Passage. So we're talking, bear with me here. Okay, so we're talking about the Smokies, one of the largest national parks in the eastern United States. I believe that Everglades is significantly larger, but at 523,000 acres, the park is brimming with wildlife. The new estimate of the black bear population in the Smokies is 1,900 animals, but there are also elk in the park, and that's what you're seeing here. This is the Cataloochee Valley, where elk were reintroduced 20 years ago in the park. They had been extirpated for about 200 years, basically hunted out of existence. The estimate of the number of animals in the park is about 150 to 200. They're not really sure, but there is an ongoing research project right now using DNA from scat to try to get a better understanding of the size of the population. There's a lone bull, looks like, one morning. So really important for me to emphasize this. National Parks Conservation Association is a convener. We're bringing people together, but this is a collaborative project. This is the sort of issue, an intractable issue. Wildlife being hit on an interstate highway with 26,500 cars estimated to travel it a day. A lot of traffic. It takes all these folks and more. We have federal, state, tribal, and non-governmental organizations who've come together in common cause to try to address this issue that I'll be talking about today. And shout out to our two research biologists. That's Steve Goodman on the left and Dr. Liz Hillard on the right. Liz works for Wildlands Network. She's our primary research partner. They make a good team, and they conducted 2 years of research in the Gorge. I'll be talking about that momentarily in 2019 and 2020. 2021 was spent analyzing the results, and this month we're rolling out recommendations for mitigation to the Departments of Transportation in both Tennessee and North Carolina. So it's a really momentous time for this particular project. Our mission is to improve wildlife's ability to cross I-40, which should result in improved public safety. Green infrastructure, such as overpasses or underpasses, when paired with fencing, can reduce wildlife vehicle collisions by 90%. These structures don't work without fencing. That's critically important. But this bird's eye view of the Gorge and Interstate 40 really lets you know how wild this landscape is. The highway itself was opened in 1968. And prior to then, it was a largely unfragmented forest. Our research area, which is 28 miles of highway, 20 miles in North Carolina from the Maggie Valley exit 20 to the state line, and from the state line to where the Foothills Parkway ties in to I-40 in Tennessee, 8 miles of project area in Tennessee. So a very, very wild landscape. And what we found with our cameras, we have 3 target species I'll talk about: black bear, elk, and white-tailed deer. But our wildlife cameras picked up lots and lots of other species in the process of our research. And I'll be showing you some of those photos. So we rely on interns. So here's Steve and for 2 overflights that he did, one with Paul Noah, who was a Duke University master's student. He interned with us and put together a story map and helped us tell the story of what it is that we're working on here. This is a really interesting perspective right here. This is one of the most important places in the Gorge. If you can see where my cursor is, this is where Interstate 40 tunneled through the mountain in both directions. And when they did this, they left the forest on top, which is a de facto land bridge. And this is where our research actually started. I got up on this land over the highway back in September of 2016, and I was absolutely flabbergasted by the amount of wildlife sign that I saw, and little to no human sign. No trash, no tracks, but there were trails made by bears and other wildlife very distinctly. So it was clear that wildlife appeared to be using that structure to get from one side of the highway to the other, and that is indeed the case. Why here? Why would we want to spend our time looking at this particular project, this site? Well, for my organization, the nexus of interest is the National Park Unit. The Smokies is the most visited park unit in the country. And a lot of the animals, they don't know where the boundary is. They come and go. There's adjacent habitat to the park, national forest land, sometimes private land. And so it's also a biodiversity hotspot. And it's also a hotspot for black bear and vehicle collisions. I'll unpack that for you in a bit. Here's the park in blue. As I said, 523,000 acres. Approximately the Appalachian Trail runs the ridgeline system on the state line for most of it. This red line here is Interstate 40, showing you where we're working outside the boundaries of the park. And a lot of our work at MPCA is what we call beyond boundaries, trying to make sure that the wildlife that comes and goes from the park actually has some protections. Our 2-year study, as I said, 2019 and 2020, with our target species, bear, elk, and white-tailed deer. That analysis went longer than we expected. By the way, here's a collared bear that showed up on one of our cameras. Park Service had collared this animal. It's one thing to hit a bear. Bears can be, they're not as big in the western part of the state as they are in the eastern part of the state because of the agriculture in the east. You can suffer some serious damage to your car or get injured personally by a collision with a bear, but it's a whole nother kettle of fish to hit an elk. A bull elk can run 1,000 pounds. You certainly do not want to hit one of those with your vehicle. And elk actually were the impetus for this project. The Forest Service announced a restoration project called the 12-Mile Project, where they sought to expand elk habitat on both sides of Interstate 40. So myself and several other colleagues, including Kim DeLozier with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation at the time, raised concerns and said, if you don't take into account how wildlife might react to these new openings they were creating, we could end up with elk on the road, and that's not something we want. And that started this conversation back in early 2017 with the stakeholders. I'm going to show you a quick video, which says more in 17 seconds than I can. It was filmed on a Sunday afternoon in August on I-40, right in the heart of our project area.
Come on, baby.
Come on.
There's one straggler in every group, isn't there? So what that shows you pretty clearly is the peril to both the drivers, I'll show it to you one more time, and wildlife. You do not want to be in a standstill on Interstate 40 anywhere along its length, particularly in the Gorge, where it's windy, the sight lines are not very good.
Keep going.
And obviously,
there we go.
The story ended well for this bear family, but it doesn't always end that way. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into our research area. Here again is the park. This is the Appalachian Trail. Comes out, crosses under I-40 right near the state line at Waterville. This is the Pigeon National Forest here. The stippled area is the Harmon Bear Sanctuary. The Harmon exit 7 is right here. There's a lot of work going on there right now. I'll talk about that. And then this is the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee. So lots of public lands. It's a mosaic of public-private, but tons of wildlife. And this is our big, hairy, audacious goal. What we would like to see is some structures built to separate drivers from wildlife, to allow the wildlife to safely cross from one side of the road to the other, reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. This particular structure is in Banff National Park in Alberta, Canada. And the gentleman who helped build these structures, Terry McGuire, is one of our consultants. We've actually engaged with him. He's been talking to the two departments of transportation in Tennessee and North Carolina and advising them because these two agencies haven't done a lot of this sort of stuff yet. Hopefully that will soon change. There's an underpass with some elk. You can see the associated fencing here to funnel them through this structure. The larger the animal, the larger the opening and the structure that you need. A bear will go through a fairly small culvert. Bobcats will too. Bobcats don't like to get their feet wet though, imagine that. But elk really need large structures, large open structures in order to feel safe enough to move through them. So our research had 4 objectives. The first 3 are to assess wildlife road mortality. And for that, we did driving surveys weekly, a little more intensively in the fall where we see most of our mortality. And then our second was to assess wildlife activity within the highway right away. We used wildlife cameras for that purpose, about 120 of them. And then we wanted to assess wildlife's use of existing structures. And I'll be showing you some animated GIFs of some of the results of wildlife using the structures. The 4th research objective was led by our partners at Wildlands Network, and that involved collaring about a dozen elk and looking at those movements and seeing where the animals travel across the landscape. So Dr. Liz Hillard led that aspect of the project for us, and the North Carolina Wildlife Federation has supported that work. So road mortality, it's a real thing. I'm sure where you live in the Triad, you see a lot of dead white-tailed deer on the side of the road, raccoons, possums, and whatnot. The elk on the left was hit in, I believe, September of 2019. It managed to get down along the banks of the Pigeon River, but it had a broken leg and the animal had to be euthanized by a Park Service biologist. And there's a dead cub near Harmon Den. We found during our 2 years, 100 dead bears in our 28-mile stretch of road. What's interesting about that is it's 6.5 times the historical mortality that the agencies had in their databases, which clearly tells us that historically from 2000 to 2018, there was not an accurate count of the amount of wildlife that was being killed on the roadway. 6.5 times more when we were doing intensive surveys. And the 100 bears that we saw, that number could be as high as 2.5 times, up to 250, because that's just what we counted on the shoulder of the road or in the median. Sometimes an animal gets hit, the carcass can be picked up by someone before we can see it, or the animal can get on the other side of the guardrail, injured or die in the woods out of sight. We were able to geo-reference all of our wildlife vehicle collisions. And very quickly, you could see there were hot spots. And these are focal areas for areas where there were higher than usual numbers of wildlife vehicle collisions. So we're taking a scientific approach. We're going to follow the science, and that gives us a lot of credibility. Regarding research objective 2, we used Reconyx cameras. 69 of them were loaned to us by the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission. So thank you to that agency. 30 of them were purchased by funds provided by the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and 40 others were purchased by private donors. And all the logos you see here are folks that were involved in this process, either by providing permits for us to do this work, or loaning us cameras or talent. Lots of people had to come together to make this possible. These cameras work, they're motion sensitive, and they also are heat sensitive. I was out on, you can see the timestamp here, December 5th, 2020 at 12:04 in the afternoon in the Gorge. And I was out in an area, saw one of our cameras, walked over and gave it the thumbs up, knowing that Steve would see the photo and probably send it to me. By the way, I do not wear this jacket in the woods during bear season. It's not advisable. So roadside cameras, here we go. You can see where they are attached to this tree, facing away from the roadway, usually within 40 meters of the road. And they were spread out over that 28-mile stretch of highway. For data collection, we have an absolutely enormous collection of photographs of wildlife, just like you couldn't imagine. More than 2,000 bear, more than 4,000 white-tailed deer, 65 elk, almost 1,000 bobcat, 15 long-tailed weasels, which is a species of special concern in North Carolina, as is spotted skunks. We photographed 7 of those. an armadillo. They're moving this way. They were not in the mountains historically. They are now. And that data is something that Steve manages. So up in the upper left-hand corner, that's a long-tailed weasel. The North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission is conducting a study in the state right now, trying to understand the population better. The lower right-hand corner is a spotted skunk. They're arboreal. They can climb trees quite well. We have an American mink up in the upper right-hand corner, and of course, there's a red fox in the lower left-hand corner. So regarding assessing that wildlife activity within the highway right-of-way, this is an interesting pair of animals. This is a cow and her calf. This cow would be seen on one side of I-40 one day and on the other side of I-40 the next day. And this was brought to our attention by rafting guides in Hartford, Tennessee. So she became objective number one for a collar and was eventually fitted with a collar. And we found that she was crossing the highway at grade, right, hopping over the concrete barrier with her calf. And the only reason she's still with us is she was doing it in the middle of the night. The animal wouldn't have a shot during the day. It's just too much traffic. To give you an idea, some of the photos we collected, this is another one of our focal species, white-tailed deer. These two mugged in front of the camera for quite some time. That's a great shot. Here's a black bear. Watch it react as a 18-wheeler goes by. Studies have shown that bears' heart rate and respiratory rate increases pretty dramatically when they approach roads. They do appear to understand the danger that roads pose, but when there's a biological imperative, either the need to reproduce or find new habitat or find food, they will cross, and it often has fatal results. So our objective to assess wildlife use of existing structures, I'm going to show you some images here. We're talking about things like, this is a series of 3 metal culverts. This is an open creek culvert, underpasses, box culverts, river bridges, and the double tunnel that I talked about earlier. So we're monitoring all of these structures. And here's a camera on one of our box culverts. You can see the box culvert in the lower right-hand corner. And this bear was very reluctant, but on the third pass, it actually went through. So you see him or her, I'm not sure what sex this animal is, reluctant, doesn't want to go, and then finally in one side and out the other. This is the same structure, no hesitation from this young bull elk, right on through. This elk was a traveler. It left the Cataloochee Valley, went to South Carolina, came back to the park, left the park again into Tennessee, followed I-40 into North Carolina, crossed under this box culvert, and then went back to Tennessee where it was legally harvested. There's no elk zone adjacent to the area where the animals were restored in North Carolina, and a deer hunter can legally harvest the elk. And that's what happened to this young bull. Here's a bobcat, no hesitation, right through, in one side and out the other. Really surprising the number of bobcats that we were able to capture on our cameras. Here's our cow and our calf. So she was fitted with the collar. This is at the Waterville Bridge. If you go to the Big Creek section of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, this is the exit you'll likely get off. And actually, you can see the white blaze for the Appalachian Trail on the bridge pier next to the calf. Right here. So some of the structures like this culvert did not pass any of our focal species. This deer came and checked it out, but ungulates don't do well in metal culverts like this. They would slip and slide their way through. We did see quite a few raccoons, though, using this structure. Raccoons will take to almost any culvert. This is another culvert. This young bear checked it out. We did not see any of our focal species move through this structure at all. Even though light, you can see the light on the other end of the tunnel. That's really important for wildlife. Often they won't use a structure like this if they can't see light. But this would be a good candidate for an enlarged structure down the road. Now, this is a really interesting series of photos. So this is November 17th, 2019. And this female bobcat and her kitten approached this culvert. The mom got in there, she's looking for her kitten, and the kitten could not figure it out, just could not figure it out. So fast forward 4 days. Same pair, watch the signal, the tail flash, and there they go. So the point being that these animals can learn to use these structures. The adults will teach the young, and then it just becomes one more passageway for them to move across their landscape through connected habitat. This is the box culvert we were looking at earlier, and this large bear didn't even think about going through. It went up and crossed at grade at the highway. This is one of our hottest hotspots for black bear mortality. So this is an area we're really looking closely for some changes that we're going to recommend to the North Carolina DOT. Our elk GPS collars, I'm not going to go into this in great detail because Dr. Hillard ran this project. But one interesting aspect of the work is that you can create a virtual fence, which means basically if an animal approaches the interstate, it sends a ping out every 20 seconds, every 20 minutes, excuse me, when it's near the interstate. Normally it sends out a location every hour or every 2 hours. But we want to see that fine scale movement when they get close to the roadway. And that proved very beneficial. You can see a number of our animals here. This is where that young bull elk was killed. I showed you early on in the picture. Here's another traveler, left the park, went to Bryson City, went all the way down to Murphy, and a bull was killed down here. Hit by a large SUV, totaled the SUV. Thankfully, the drivers were not killed. And again, you can see some really fine scale data when you zoom in. One of the groups that's involved with this is the Eastern Cherokee Indians, and they are particularly concerned with the stretch of US 19 between Maggie Valley and Cherokee because the tribal members are disproportionately impacted by wildlife vehicle collisions involving elk. So the collar data is going to be very useful to help understand where animals are crossing, and you can see they're really all over this roadway here. This is just outside of Maggie Valley, where the Blue Ridge Parkway connects to the park. So this is a series of blueprints. I mentioned Harmon Den earlier. 4 months into our research in 2019, North Carolina DOT announced that they were going to replace 5 bridges in our project area. Not for wildlife benefit, because the bridges had simply structurally aged out. They were over 50 years old. They needed to be replaced. When they told us Harmon Den was one of the places where they were going to replace the bridge, this is a really important area. It's a mortality hotspot. This is where elk first crossed under the highway to get to the other side of the highway from the park. And a lot of bear activity, lots of activity right outside the right of way. We asked them to do some wildlife modifications to the bridge replacement, and they said they couldn't do it because the scope of the project was bridge replacement only. It was not a wildlife project. So the NGO partners and I talked, and we decided that we would come up with a fund. We asked the DOT, if you can't do it, can we pay for the wildlife enhancements? And they agreed. And so at that point, the Safe Passage campaign was birthed, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Right now, this bridge is nearing completion. It's going to be opened in May. They're building 2 benches on either side of Cold Spring Creek underneath here. They're removing an expansion joint. It'll be a much quieter structure. It's going to be wildlife fencing. There's going to be cattle guards on the on-ramp so that elk can't walk up the on-ramp to get on the highway. They're going to de-vegetate here. There's grass and things that elk would browse on, and so that's going to be removed. There's some nice enhancements are going on here. It's a really nice outcome for us. You know, it's very difficult to mitigate here. I'm not going to pull any punches and say there's easy solutions, because if you look at the topography, It's very challenging. I'm not an engineer. Our recommendations are going to be vetted by engineers for feasibility. All we can do is recommend and then let the experts say, can you do something here or not? I mentioned Safe Passage. This is our logo. We call ourselves Safe Passage, the I-40 Pigeon River Gorge Wildlife Crossing Project. We've got a lot of coverage since we launched this. I've been interviewed on several podcasts. It's been all over the papers. Maybe some of you have read about it in one form or fashion, while on social media as well. This is some of our collateral material where we're tugging on people's heartstrings to ask them to open up their purse strings. We have raised over $110,000 since the start of this campaign, and we have not actually started a capital campaign yet. So very exciting. People respond positively. This is a project that is hugely popular with the people. I haven't met a single person who said that's a really bad idea in 5 years. If you want to visit our Safe Passage site, you can do so at smokiessafepassage.org. You can give us your email address so we can stay in touch with you and let you know about developments. You could donate if you like. You could take a pledge. So if you would visit that website, check it out. If you are on social media, maybe you'd consider sharing that and helping us spread the word about what it is that we're trying to do. One of the really super exciting things that happened is that Francis Feigert, who works for Great Smoky Mountains Association, decided to write a children's book about our work. And the book, A Search for Safe Passage, was published last year. It's the animals are anthropomorphized. However, there are, in the back of the book, after the fictional story takes place, there are species accounts for 20 different mammals that we see on our cameras, including their tracks and also information about road ecology, how you can actually make a difference on roads. What's an overpass look like? What's a wildlife underpass look like? So it's a really good resource for young people. It's focused for readers age 7 to 13. The presentation is about over, and I'm going to leave you with this really cool video. My colleague Steve, all of our cameras are set to still images, but they have the capability to take video. So I asked Steve, I said, is there somewhere you can set a camera on video close enough to see the traffic, hear the traffic, and pick up wildlife? So he set this camera for us. It's the gift that keeps on giving. And if you can figure out how many bears there are here. That noise in the background is the traffic. Let's see. Hello. The traffic. Ah, one more. I want to thank you very much for your time, your interest in this project. And I want to turn it back to our hosts and see if you all have any questions you want to ask. Thank you so much.
Great, Jeff, thank you very much. It was a great presentation. I'm going to, let's see, if you have questions, if you could just type them in the chat box, I think that would be the easiest way to do it. And then I can read them to Jeff and let him answer them.
Sure, I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how to do it. Dun, dun, dun. I hid the controls. Let me just close this out. Boom. There we go. Screen sharing has stopped. Okay.
Right. So Heather Russell commented on the book you mentioned. She said it's a great book. I'm assuming she's already read it. What have you?
It's available from Great Smoky Mountains Association, or you can find it on Amazon. Great thing to gift to a young person.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have a quick question for you. The bear video we saw at the end, it kind of got fuzzy. Was that because the bears were playing with the camera?
Yeah, they were playing with the camera. The bear breathed on the lens and it fogged the lens, but they were also pulling on the cable, the security cable that lashes it to a tree. Are there other projects after this one opens in May? Sure, that's a great point. So I just want to reiterate, this Harmon Den bridge replacement was not envisioned when we started this project. It just simply fell in our lap, and the agency was willing to work with us if we said we raised some money. So there's a lot more that's going to happen beyond this. This is not even part of our recommendations. It's just something that occurred. It was an opportunity, and I'm so grateful that the North Carolina DOT was willing to work with us. So, question: these projects are, of course, huge undertakings, super costly. If a group of people locally want to work on a smaller wildlife crossing project, is there anything possible on a smaller level? I think it would have to be on a case-by-case basis, and I don't know how willing the DOT would be to work with smaller groups. The fact of the matter is that, you know, we're building this community of practice. We're learning from each other. We're building trust, right? Thankfully, we were able to meet in person for 3 years before the pandemic hit. We've not met face-to-face in 2 years. And on March 29th, that's changing. We're going to be meeting, we're having a virtual meeting. So it will be in a Zoom space, but also we'll be at the Haywood Community College. They have a great wildlife program there. And the head of the wildlife program is going to have his students there assisting us as we work through the recommendations and learn about it together. So we have a question here from Joni, it looks like. I'm not wearing my glasses. Joni, as whitewater kayakers, Angie, Dave, and I have seen the landscape from the road and the river. It's great to see how we're recognizing the necessity of wildlife corridors. Thank you, Joni. And I'll share this with you. In 2019, I got paid to go rafting on the Pigeon River because these guides were telling me, hey, there's an elk and her calf hanging out right between the river and the road. And sure enough, I got to raft and I got to see that. Will future crossings be over I-40 or under or both? Hopefully both. We're going to recommend both of those things. I don't want to go into specifics because the DOT hasn't seen the recommendations yet. They're in a draft format. They're currently being reviewed by a technical committee. This is a federal, state, tribal, and non-governmental folks who are familiar technically with what we're trying to do. And so they're vetting the report before we send it to the DOTs. We will be sending it to the DOTs on March the 15th, and then to the full stakeholder group a week later. And then the following week we're meeting. So very, very significant month in the history of this program. You mentioned the collar and the elk pinging when it gets near the road. What exactly will that tell you? So we're not as concerned about where the animals are moving through the forest away from the road, right? So once they get within the boundaries that are established for that virtual fence, it shows you those closer movements. You know, elk can go a long way in an hour or two. So if you don't have a ping every 20 minutes, you might not know how the animal crossed the road, right? So with that finer scale data, super helpful. Peter asked, how long will these construction projects take on average? That's a question I can't answer because I don't know what it is that we're going to do yet. This is a collaborative. You know, we probably can't do everything because there are not unlimited resources, so we'll need to prioritize. Those hotspots will be a focal area for us. And I'm confident that the way we've been working together will result in some tangible benefits for both motorists and wildlife. It just remains to be seen what that will be. And that's the exciting part, right? Do you see animals prefer over or under the highway? Really good question. So road ecology actually looks at the behavior of individual species. So cats, for instance, are stealthy. They prefer to go under. They will go over, but that's just the nature of a cat. They're stealthy. Elk like the larger open structures, so an overpass would probably be better for them. Bear will use culverts. They'll use an overpass. And we selected our focal species, by the way, because they're large. You can quantify damage to a vehicle. You can make an economic case that if you can mitigate 90% of the collisions over a 75-year period, which is the estimated life of a wildlife overpass, that it's actually cheaper to build a structure than to leave those recurring costs in place over 75 years. So we're trying to make an economic case here. There is, Robin says, I know there's a similar project underway in California. What other states are making strides? Really good point. That the work that I think you're referring to in California is in Mono County near Mammoth Lakes. And I lived in Mono County before moving to North Carolina to work for MPCA. I was working on a national monument campaign on a BLM landscape known as the Bodie Hills. And there are, in Mono County, when I lived there, an estimated 33,000 mule deer in 3 large herds.
Wow.
That's 2.5 deer for each resident of Mono County. And a lot of people come up from LA, Southern California to go skiing, and the deer are crossing the road. I mean, it can be a real mess. But other states, Oregon, Washington, Montana, New Mexico, Arizona. Arizona is an interesting case. Someone hit an elk that had already been hit, was in the road, and was badly injured. A driver was badly injured and sued the state because the state was aware that this was a hotspot. And so the liability issue that the state faced was the impetus for them building a wildlife overpass in that location. So there are some real significant issues. If a DOT knows that wildlife are getting killed there could be some vulnerability. So very interesting case. For over highway crossings, is there specific vegetation that is planted? It certainly would be vegetated. I don't know. I can't go into specifics because again, I'm a facilitator and an organizer, and we're relying on experts like Terry McGuire and others who've done this. Is there any interest from vehicle insurance companies? Not yet, but we have talked to Commissioner Mike Causey, who's the Commissioner of Insurance in North Carolina. We hope to revisit that conversation with him. It would be great to get support from insurance companies, but thus far, we haven't seen it. Did I miss any questions there? Or did I hit them all?
It looks to me like you got them all. I was reading them as you were going through them. So.
Sure. Does anyone want to just ask a question straight up instead of typing? Thank you, Joni.
Any other questions?
I guess I might have missed what I was taking notes when you were talking, but we had a program recently on the Red Wolf Project in the eastern part of the state. And sadly, we lost a lot of the red wolves that were released last year due to them being hit by cars. So could that potentially be a hotspot area for this project to move to the eastern part of the state?
That's a good question. I know that Travis he works for the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, and he is the liaison to the DOT, and he's been very involved in that project on Highway 64. I don't know that MPCA itself will get involved because there isn't a nexus with the National Park unit there. It's a National Wildlife Refuge, the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. But that community of practice that I talked about, right? There's the benefit because we're all learning.
Right.
We're also starting to take a look, by the way, at Interstate 26, which is the next interstate to the north of I-40. And interestingly, when that opened in 2000 or 2001, I actually through hiked the Appalachian Trail in 2000. When I got to Sam's Gap, I-26 wasn't open yet. It opened the next year. They built some wildlife underpasses, but the fencing is all wrong. In 20 years, the discipline of road ecology has come a long way. Instead of the fencing basically becoming a funnel, it's like this. It almost excludes wildlife on the outside here. So we got a permit. We just deployed some cameras. We're starting to turn our attention there, and we think the fixes are much less costly than what we're seeing on I-40 because it's mostly a fencing thing.
Interesting.
Well, I think this is wonderful, and I hope that you just continue to get more and more support. I think it's important for wildlife, it's important for human safety, and just if you think about the amount of damage done to vehicles and how much it costs to repair them and the resources that go into that, roads are not a good thing for wildlife. So, and we have more and more of them.
Yeah, I tell people, wildlife didn't evolve with roads, right? It just doesn't know how to deal with it. Think of the poor possum, right? What's its defense mechanism? Plays dead. Doesn't work very well on roads. You lay down on the road, you're probably going to be dead after not too long. Couple more questions. Joni wanted to know, are the same animals impacted on I-26? Yes, the deer, bear, and not as many elk that far north, but we did have an elk actually hit on I-26 near Sam's Gap a month after that bull was killed. We had one killed up on I-26, so a much larger animal. Thankfully, no one was injured there. How long does it take to build these passageways? It's all situational, site specific. It depends what it is that you're looking at. Obviously, the DOT is going to be very sensitive to any traffic generated as a result of doing this kind of work. So right now with Harm and Den, even though they're doing some wildlife work, but that's not driving the project. There are signs up directing people to take I-26 to I-81 or I-81 to I-26 as a detour around I-40. And actually, I'm in Knoxville, and I'm headed home as soon as I'm done with this talk tonight. So I haven't picked my route yet. I might go through Johnson City, I-81 to I-26.
So Jeff, I have a question. So Greensboro, or the Triad area, is in the process of building several interstate beltways around the cities. Greensboro's is almost finished. Winston's just getting started. Does the DOT, as a general rule, the highway comes very close to my house. I can unfortunately hear the traffic. And I know, we used to have a fair number of deer, still do, but when that thing first opened, probably in the first week, I saw 3 or 4 dead deer on the highway. Does the DOT, as a normal process of building a highway, do they take wildlife into consideration? Do they build? I know they put some fencing up, but it's certainly not going to keep a deer from jumping over. It's only 3 or 4 feet high.
Sure. It goes back to the slide, why here, right? So think about this, Peter. Would we want to build a wildlife overpass that could cost $5 or $10 million to move deer from one suburban neighborhood to another? Or would it be better to expend those resources where you have public lands? And in fact, our research has showed the black bear issue is tied to the public lands. Most of our white-tailed deer get killed where there's private land. Most of the black bear get killed in the national forest. So I'm not saying that, in suburbia, you shouldn't have these sort of things. It just comes down to, if there are limited resources, where would you want to build these things? Would you want to build something where development hasn't destroyed the habitat and you still have pretty good habitat left? That's where I would want to expend the resources. But again, it's all situational on a case-by-case basis.
But does the DOT have any sort of standard policies whenever they build roads about wildlife or not?
I think that that was your question, and I didn't mean to dodge it.
No, I got what you're saying. No, I understand that. That makes sense what you said.
They have a goal of 0 wildlife vehicle collisions, right? That's obviously not happening. In fact, the DOT put out a study in 3 years, 2017 to 2019, they had 56 or 58,000 wildlife vehicle collisions. But guess what? The only way one of those incidents landed on the report is if there was a police report. How many people call the police when they hit a deer or a bear? If your vehicle is disabled, right, there's gonna be a police report because you need to be towed. If there are injuries, there's gonna need to be a police report. But we're vastly undercounting the significance is 1 to 2 million large animals are killed every year in the United States on roads. Staggering numbers.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot.
Well, folks, I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for what you do. Congratulations on launching your new club, your organization, whatever you're calling it. I wish you the most success and truly an honor. And I love the picture that Heather has of the, gosh, why can't I, cardinal flower with the Hummer. We're looking forward to seeing the cardinal flower in our front yard in August. I think that's when it blooms.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, on behalf of both Triad chapter and the state chapter, thank you so much for your time and your willingness to hold this for us. We really appreciate it. It was very educational. I know it was for me. I think I'm speaking for everyone when I say that. And we appreciate your time and we wish you the best of luck and look forward to continuing to support you and your efforts and the program.
Thank you, Peter. Last word, if any of you ever interact with your state representatives or your congressional representatives, let them know that this is the wildlife is important to you and you want to see more. Oh, I left out one really important piece of information. Congress passed a bill with $350 million for wildlife crossings over a 5-year period of time. So there are resources now available. And we're trying to line up to figure out how to get some of that money here.
That's great. Again, thank you, Jeff.
Thank you so much,
Appreciate
Jeff. We
Thanks,
appreciate
Jeff.
it. Bye.
Bye-bye. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, y'all. Thank you for joining us.